Things had been going well for the forces of King Muatali. The Egyptians, in their arrogance, had been tricked into approaching the battlefield far more closely than intended. Unclear of what was happening west of the Orontes, a column of infantry has been sent across to help pick off any Egyptian survivors after the devastating ambush that opened the battle. The battlefield is a chaotic place even when victory is close at hand. Clouds of dust race across the rocky terrain as the last of the Egyptians are chased off by the mighty Hittite chariots. The soldiers can just about breathe when they cover their mouths, though the shadowy outline of the city of Kadesh is no longer visible. A column of Hittite infantry, some in segmented bronze armour, most just in hides. Here's a war horn, a signal to reposition. But they can't see for all the dust of battle. Then, a shadow emerges from the cloud of dust, which resolves into the sleek figure of Egypt's death machine. Arrows rain over them, not just from the chariot they can see, but from within the cloud of sand and shadow that surrounds them. Some run, some make it even a few meters. Most are not given the chance. How many chariots are there? How are they here so quickly when they were last seen a mile away? By the time the Egyptians have returned into the Shroud of Sand, there are no Hittites left to wonder. The chariot was the supreme weapon of the age, and Egypt had mastered its construction and deployment. But this wasn't always the case. Even as Ramesses the Great sent his nation's mightiest military hardware onto the battlefield, it was not so long ago in the grand scale of Egyptian history that the chariot had brought the Kingdoms of Horus to their knees. At least, in legend. In reality? Well, let's start from the beginning. If you're hep to the Egyptian jive, then you can probably guess the titles of the next two sections of the video, and you're probably right. But I'm not just splitting this video into the so-called Golden Ages of Egypt, because that's the way ancient Egyptian history is normally split. The existence of these periods and their downfall has to do in large part with the military technology and the overall military paradigms of the age. Egypt was unified by war, like the Italian peninsula during the age of the Roman Republic, like England in the centuries leading to 1066. Not now, William! Like so many nation-states, ancient and modern. The first pharaoh was Narmer, who was also probably the man historians would later transcribe as Menes, although this is less than certain, and someday soon I'll talk about why it's so easy to get the names of pharaohs mixed up. Narmer was not the first king of the region. What we call Egypt now was once two kingdoms. In point of fact, if you've seen my stela on the names for Egypt, you'll know that for all of its existence, ancient Egypt was regarded as two kingdoms, at least in name. Narmer and his forces would have been armed with spears and maces. In Narmer's time, the majority of both would be tipped with stone. The heads of the maces were carved into a pear-like shape, ensuring that they would be a little lighter and thus faster to wield, still deliver a devastating blow, and perhaps shatter less often than their earlier spherical forms. In Narmer's time, however, the transition from stone to copper weaponry was well underway. Did you expect me to say bronze? Not quite, and for Egypt, not for a while. Narmer and his men would not have been armoured in any real sense, beyond the paltry protection the king might have derived from ceremonial animal skins. Any armour worth its weight is a composite. Even a suit of medieval plate was not complete without padded cloth underneath to take the last energy out of the enemy's strike. And composites are a feat of engineering. The human body is the weapon system of the ancient world, and the human body fights best when it is given its full range of movement, is not encumbered, and doesn't overheat or become exhausted. If it seems strange to you that they might have fought with no protection at all, remember that most of the soldiers in the world wars were unarmoured. The cost-to-benefit ratio was too high. In the trenches of France, or the rolling hills of Celtic Britain, or in the trodden desert sands that surround the Nile, the slow and the tired are dead men walking. Egypt, of course, did not have a standing army at this time. There was no professional soldier, no force of elite specialised warriors. These were labourers, putting the strength of their backs, usually reserved for tilling fields, into the defence of their homes and the advancement of their king's ambitions. It was a force of ordinary people being asked to do something extraordinary to the benefit of a wealthy man with everything to gain. In the end, even now, it often is. But many of the skills needed in everyday Egyptian life could be applied to the battlefield. Archery, useful in hunting and wildlife control since long before humans settled in the Nile Valley, was a skill employed to great effect by the early Egyptian military. They used single-arched bows, whose strings or uncomplicated staves might snap under tension, whose arrows might break upon loosing, and which lacked the range and power of the bows of the later Bronze Age. Expensive weapons, more reliable and powerful than chucking a javelin, but perhaps only just if you don't have the right materials. The Old Kingdom soon abandoned the stone-headed mace in favour of the copper-tipped spear and copper-headed axe. Copper, of course, won't shatter like stone, is lighter, and can take a more reliable edge, though the edge will dull reasonably quickly. The Old Kingdom soldier also carried a shield, a fairly simple thing, a wooden frame with wicker or animal hide stretched over it. Nothing to stop the direct strike of a point-blank arrow or spear tip, but good against the glancing blows from an enemy's mace or axe, and even reasonable shelter against a rogue arrow from far enough away. As the Old Kingdom wound on, something like what we would call feudalism fell into place, certainly where the military was concerned. Regional governors, nomarchs, would be called upon to raise armies that would ultimately be placed under the command of the pharaoh. For all that their technology was a little underwhelming by later Bronze Age standards, it sufficed for the time being, and with the Old Kingdom's robust centralised economy and strong government, it was able to raise effective armies quickly, to put down rebellion or expand Egypt's borders. Remember, this was the same kingdom that erected the pyramids. For better or worse, it knew how to put its people to work. Soldiers were paid, as all labourers were paid at the time, from the state granaries, sacks of grain and jugs of beer. It wasn't a prestigious thing for a person to do, but if there weren't other jobs going and you were physically healthy and at least passably strong, it was easy enough work to get. The Old Kingdom stretched south into what we would call the Sudan and northeast as far as modern-day Gaza, all of which being the result of military expedition, and all of which showing that while there was no standing professional army, it was war season at least as regularly as it was tomb-building season. I think this early military success might have set Egypt up for problems later. Let's think for a moment about the poisoned chalice that is early success. I almost called it beginner's luck, but it wasn't luck. The Egyptians made use of the resources and technical advances available to them, and their robust government and economy ensured they could marshal a military force able to safeguard their lands and resolve internal disputes. Of course, the nomarchs were the ones raising the armies, and in time the nomarchs began to wonder what exactly they needed a pharaoh for anyway, but the fall of the Old Kingdom is a topic for another time. The next iteration of the two kingdoms took the example of its early success and decided to do more, but not much different, and that might have been its downfall.
You're just going through an awkward phase from 12 to 29.
The Old Kingdom fell apart as power decentralised, but Egypt was eventually reunified under kings, again through military action, and the ambitious warrior pharaohs of the Middle Kingdom were determined that they would not be as complacent as their forebears. The man widely regarded as the first pharaoh of this new era was Mentuhotep, a name meaning Mentu is satisfied. Mentu or Montu, probably neither, was a falcon-headed warrior god, envisioned originally as the burning wrath of the sun. Mentu was the shining ray of justice that destroyed untruthfulness and anarchy, two great evils in the Egyptian mind, who eventually occupied a comfortable role as a war god. And Mentu must indeed have been satisfied, for his namesake used strategic cunning and tactical might to put an end to a rival dynasty and reunite Egypt. Mentuhotep spent much of his 51-year reign regaining Egyptian control over the Upper Nile, restoring its powerful influence over the Sinai Peninsula, and re-establishing the divinity of the great kings of Egypt. During the Middle Kingdom, Egypt started taking its military very seriously. Forts were built to guard it against threats from the east. Expeditions were sent southeast to expand Egyptian influence along the Red Sea. The Buhen fortress remains among the most impressive ruins in that part of the world. It fell and was rebuilt centuries later, proving its strategic importance. But more than that, it was a tangible signal to the Nubians that Egypt was serious about its presence in the region. Historically, the end of this era and the start of what's called the Second Intermediate Period has been seen as the result of invasion by a foreign force called the Hyksos. But this is based on an account from over 1300 years after the events took place, an account by Manetho, whose agenda was to promote the historical supremacy of the Egyptian culture. Contemporary evidence seems to show that the Hyksos pharaohs emerged from a Canaanite people who had been immigrating into Egypt since the beginning of the Middle Kingdom. For anyone who might not be sure, let me state clearly, immigration is a good thing. The free movement of human beings is not only a right, but essential to the thriving of civilization. Egypt understood this, and understood that the benefits were not only economical, but technological. The Canaanites had learned crafts the Egyptians were yet to master, such as large-scale boat building, woodworking in general, and certain aspects of metallurgy. The later narrative of invasion was gobbled up by Europeans in the 19th and 20th centuries who couldn't imagine mass immigration as a benevolent event. Do I need to emphasise the blood-boiling irony of that? For some reason, the 14th dynasty came to what appears to be an ignoble end. It seems as though the Delta region was afflicted with a plague or famine, resulting in population changes and a destabilisation of the pharaoh's power. Either way, the Canaanite Hyksos established their own dynasty in the vacuum, and any peace that might have existed between the two peoples evaporated. Deprived of a unifying Egyptian pharaoh, Egypt fractured, and the Hyksos became the enemy. They could not only build ships with their woodworking knowledge, but something they picked up from even farther east, the chariot. The chariot revolutionised warfare. Horses at the time were not bred for height, temperament and agility the way they later would be, so humans couldn't ride them very effectively. A chariot was a platform pulled by two horses. On the platform stood a rider and an archer. Not overwhelmingly suitable for rough terrain or marshland, the chariot had only limited applications within Egypt, but was more than enough to see to it that the Hyksos could defend themselves. Later propaganda would paint them as bloodthirsty tyrants, but it seems more in keeping with contemporary evidence to suggest that the Hyksos were interested in establishing peace and defending themselves while doing so. Perhaps the Egyptians had fallen prey to the age-old hypocrisy that immigrants are valued if they participate in society, but not if they go on to earn power within it. The Hyksos had been early adopters of tin bronze, what you and I usually mean when we describe bronze, but arsenic can be used in place of tin. The Egyptians did have metallurgical ability, but weren't alloying copper and tin much before 2000 BCE, and were still making weapons out of copper well into the Middle Kingdom. Their unarmoured, unhelmeted, hide-shielded infantry with their copper-tipped spears weren't doing very well against the chariots and bronze swords of the Hyksos. Bronze kept a better edge for longer than copper, though the formulation of bronze, the ratio of copper to tin, was something that would be refined through the centuries, through trial and error. What worked for a mirror or an ornament might not work quite as well for something intended to keep an edge. Of course, just as the Hyksos and Egyptians had been integrating before Hyksos rule, the bulk of the citizenry of the region the Hyksos ruled were Egyptians. Egyptians were building the chariots, breeding the horses, learning these new methods of manufacture and fighting, and they weren't going to forget these techniques if Hyksos rule ever came to an end, which eventually it did. By the time the Hyksos were seen off after a prolonged conflict, the Egyptians had spent over a century understanding and refining the design of the Canaanite chariot. They had improved upon it considerably, making sure that the balance of speed and power was finely honed. They changed the number of spokes on the wheels from 4 to 6, sturdier than a Hyksos chariot, but faster than the chariots built farther east. They evolved the structure of the cab so that they achieved the perfect ratio of sturdiness, weight, speed, and agility. They also learned from the Hyksos new techniques for the manufacture of bows. The composite bow was made of materials with fantastic properties for archery, combined so that each component's weakness was compensated for by the strength of another component. Wood on its own is the powerhouse of the bow, but it can't bend too far or too many times before it breaks, so the belly of the bow was coated with horn. The belly is the part that faces the archer, that must resist compression and be able to spring back and be compressed again and again. The back of the bow, the part that faces outwards, was augmented with sinew beaten into a fibrous mesh. The sinew was there to resist tension, so that when the outer part of the bow was stretched and abruptly relaxed as the arrow was loosed, the overall structure of the bow wasn't threatened. These 3 layers were laminated together with a tough, slow-setting glue that was sturdy and flexible, but vulnerable to moisture. These bows were powerful. Don't imagine arrows sticking out of an enemy soldier like they would in a game of Skyrim. These arrows were moving fast, and humans are made of jelly. A lot of the time, the arrow has flown right through the enemy and out the other side. Even so, composite bows were expensive and time-consuming to produce. The lamination alone was done in stages over a period between a year and 18 months. The expense of making them and the difficulty in maintaining them limited their use. For the most part, composite bows were reserved for chariot archers, who would frequently be firing at a reasonably close distance and often at armoured enemies. The composite bow sent its bronze-tipped arrows straight through leather and even light-scale armour at such distances. Most infantry archers, who would not be closing with the enemy, would likely have continued to use the simpler stave bows of yesteryear. Egypt was unified, had learned from the weapons of its enemies, and knew never to repeat its technological complacency of before. It had taken the Hyksos death machines, improved them, optimised them for Egyptian tactics, and the time had at last come to return to the world stage with dreams of empire.
Now it's time to rock the show. Come on, you are the star tonight.
The new kingdom saw Egypt rocket into the heights of empire, and there were plenty of internal societal changes to go with that ascent. Their religion shifted, the strata of their society shifted, and even the power of the pharaoh moulded itself according to the necessities of the age. Military technology would have an impact on society at large. The chariot and composite bow needed well-trained warriors to use them if they were to have any value on the battlefield. Both were expensive and time-consuming to produce, and chariots would often break in long battles on rough terrain. If you were going to deploy them, you needed to know that you had your best horsemen, your best archers, to make use of the technology. This meant men who trained for years, professional soldiers dedicated to the control of chariots and high-speed archery. Elite cavaliers, Bronze Age knights became a new stratum of Egyptian society. These were prestigious positions. A charioteer would be received back home as a hero, and it was a role reserved largely for the upper classes. Chariots themselves were prestige objects, which we see from later tombs, where gilded chariots are among the grave goods of the pharaohs. Tutankhamun's tomb contains 6 remarkably well-preserved chariots. No mummified horses, which seems like a missed opportunity, but hindsight is 20/20. In later ages, when the chariot was tactically obsolete, they were still used recreationally for centuries, not only in races, with teams of charioteers hurrying around an elongated track, but as vehicles for later pharaohs and their courts to go hunting in. Armed with these weapons, and with the incomparable motivation that comes from looking in the mirror each morning and seeing the shining face of a living god, it's no wonder New Kingdom pharaohs were so interested in expanding and consolidating their empires, and no wonder that their territorial ambition was met with resistance. Clashes with other empires were inevitable. I know I haven't talked about the naval power of Egypt yet, which does seem a bit weird. Egypt was on both the Red Sea and the Mediterranean after all, and possessed what geologists refer to technically as a bloody great river running through it. Boats and ships were important to the Egyptians, without question, but until later in the Middle Kingdom these were largely transports, not warships. This did give the army advantages. They could be deployed almost anywhere in Egypt and would arrive relatively fresh, which wouldn't be the case if they'd marched for weeks in the desert. Egypt, however, didn't have a decent supply of wood for shipbuilding. they had to maintain trade links with Byblos and Cyprus, and did buy wood that way for building their own ships. We even have evidence from the 18th dynasty of Egypt putting orders into foreign shipyards and buying ships as part of large trade deals. As with their chariots, Egypt had a preference for sleeker, more agile warships. Their tactic was to keep at range and shower the enemy in arrows and slung stones, and when the enemy was vulnerable, to grapple the other ship and board with spear and axe. A navy was a great thing for Egypt, but it meant they needed stable links with their wood-producing trade partners. When that trade came under threat, Egypt could only respond in the strongest possible way. This leads us to where the video began, the Battle of Kadesh. The great Bronze Age superpowers all clashed, to different degrees, for dominance over the area we call the Near East. And by the time of the 19th dynasty, Egypt was butting horns with Assyrians and Mitanni from Mesopotamia and the Anatolian Hittites. Egypt and the Hittites would clash epically outside the city of Kadesh, which today is in Syria, a stone's throw from the Lebanese border. The capture and holding of Kadesh would have meant Egypt having a stable gateway into and protection from Mesopotamia. Unfortunately, it meant the same thing for the Hittites, and I think hindsight proves that they both should have been paying far more attention to the Assyrians. But, as the charioteer said to the stable hand, let's park that for now. The Egyptian army had become large and well equipped, and large armies need to be divided in order to make best use of their numbers and versatility in battle. So, let's talk about the composition of the Egyptian army at the time of the Battle of Kadesh. The overall force was divided first into two, the North and South armies. Each of these was then split into 4 divisions named after some of the most powerful Egyptian deities, namely Amun, Ptah, Ra, and Set. The pharaoh seems to have directly commanded the Amun division by convention, but each division would have commanders, often selected from the royal family or prominent noble families. The division commanders would also be in charge of hiring, training, and integrating foreign mercenaries. There were, for example, 5 known commanders at Kadesh under Ramesses. Oh, hey buddy! The Khopesh, that famous Egyptian sickle, should be mentioned here, starting with the fact that it wasn't a sickle and might not have been Egyptian. Oh, you were getting in the comments, weren't you? No, just a bit of classic misdirection. A sickle's bladed edge is on the inside. A Khopesh is a hybrid axe and sword. Its curved cutting edge on the outside of the curve transferred an awful lot of energy into a very small area. Some designs feature a stabbing point at the end to keep the enemy from closing in with his own sword, and the hooked shape of the blade allows for the grabbing and deflection of an enemy's weapon. It might have been Egyptian. Some of the earliest depictions of the Khopesh are from Mesopotamian sources. It's also entirely likely that the design came about because of the desire for a faster axe, and the transition in that part of the world from axe to straight sword. The Hittites at Kadesh, for example, were already using straight swords. The name Khopesh comes from the word chapash for leg, and you can see the determinative here clearly showing an ox leg, its shape very reminiscent of the Khopesh's distinctive blade. Chariots were part of these previously discussed divisions, but operated independently in battle. The Egyptian chariots were developed to harass the enemy with fast sorties, quick turns, and the ability to overtake and devastate almost any other force on the battlefield. The chariots of Kadesh were organised into 25 vehicle companies, though it looks as though they formed into squadrons of 50 when on the attack. Chariots might also be used more distantly, a company taking its archers somewhere to shoot at the enemy from a distance. When the archers were threatened, they would get back onto their chariots and reposition before the enemy infantry could catch up. Chariot archers were very well trained, able to hit targets with reasonable accuracy, even at a chariot's top speed of somewhere between 20 and 25 miles an hour. Chariots would also be used to charge enemy infantry with the intention of causing the infantry to break, and allow the chariot charge to be followed up by infantry taking advantage of the broken enemy line. In practice, this had mixed results. The horses would often refuse to close up fully with the enemy infantry, While the infantry have likely fled by the time this becomes a problem, the horses then have to turn. If they panic, stop abruptly, or move in a direction contrary to the manufacturer's recommendations, the chariot was at risk of damage, destruction, or separation from its horses. To ensure that happened as little as possible, the driver had to know how to handle the horses and what his chariot was capable of in a sharp turn. Uneven ground, poor maintenance, and stressed horses all took their toll. Egyptian chariots paid for their speed with flimsiness. A chariot not in use had to be transported upside down, or the weight of the cab would compress the wheels, robbing them of their circular shape. Turning too sharply ran the risk of pulling the horses out of their yoke or loosening a wheel from the axle. If shortcuts were taken in the construction, maintenance, or repair of a chariot, the riders would often pay with their lives. Of course, both sides at Kadesh had chariots, so it probably helps to talk about the difference between Hittite and Egyptian chariots. And it was a significant difference. This is probably one of the earliest examples of an actively competitive international arms race, and the difference between these two chariots is iconic. Where the Egyptians opted for speed and agility, the Hittites opted for heft and active protection. A Hittite chariot featured a 3-man crew, a driver, an archer, and a shield bearer. A common chariot versus chariot tactic was to ride up alongside and pepper the enemy chariot's cab or horses with arrows. Having someone with a shield meant this was much harder, and they wielded a long spear to make sure enemy chariots, or very enterprising infantry, couldn't get too close. This extra protection, however, meant their chariots were considerably slower than the Egyptians and much less agile. At Kadesh, this would have significant consequences. The Hittites made camp on one side of the Orontes, with the Egyptians on the other, and Kadesh between them. Through misdirection, the Hittites were able to confuse the Egyptian approach, giving the Egyptians the courage to move closer than they might have liked to the Hittite camp. The Hittite king, Muwatalli, ordered a surprise cavalry charge, with mixed results. They managed to scatter the Egyptian Ra division that was still moving into position, and smash into the Amun division's camp. Here come the mixed results. As in all forms of cavalry charge throughout the history of warfare, chariots rely on speed and momentum. If you slow them, if you stop them, they're very vulnerable. By smashing into Ra in a surprise attack, the Hittites lost some of that momentum, and although they did manage to reach the Amun camp, their impact there was less than what was hoped for. Even so, the Amun division, unreinforced by Ra, was forced to reposition. The Hittites had thought the Egyptian army was scattered and had begun to loot their camp. When the Egyptian king Ramesses led a countercharge, the Hittites were caught unawares. They began to withdraw, but their slower chariots were soon overtaken. They suffered extremely heavy losses. While they engaged in a botched withdrawal, the Egyptians skirmished with their lighter, more agile chariots, and after a total of 6 charges, the Hittite forces on the west side of the river were devastated. The Hittite charioteers who were lucky enough to evade the Egyptians had to abandon their chariots at the river and swim for their lives, leading many to drown. A squadron of 50 chariots, in the tight, agile formations the Egyptians' sleeker vehicles could afford to use, might put out 1,000 arrows in a minute. Against clustered infantry or slower-moving large targets like Hittite chariots, that's a terrifying concept. To put that into a context more relatable to the age of firearms, many modern machine guns put out between 600 and 1500 rounds per minute, so a squadron of chariots at the top of their game is indeed a thing of terror. By the time the Hittites' reinforcements were in position, so were fresh Egyptian troops from the Ptah division. The Hittites withdrew, and Ramesses returned to Egypt, proclaiming this a great victory. But was it? No. The Battle of Kadesh was overall a success for the Egyptians, but strategically, it was a decided draw. The Egyptians didn't have the resources or logistics in place to sustain a siege, so no attempt was made on their part. They had arrived thinking that Kadesh would surrender, not expecting the Hittite army, led by King Muwatalli, even to be there. When it became clear that Kadesh wasn't going to surrender, Ramesses simply withdrew. Egypt would never again enjoy influence over Kadesh or the lands beyond it, and the fighting between Egypt and the Hittites had emboldened their mutual rivals, the Assyrians. The Hittites and Egyptians both claimed victory at Kadesh, and in some ways each of them was right. Ramesses had been victorious in the arms race. The Egyptian preference for speed and agility had won out in open battle. However, Muwatalli maintained vital control of Kadesh. The tremendous scale of the battle should be remarked upon because it speaks to the seriousness of each king's claim over the region. In total, somewhere between 60 and 100,000 soldiers were involved. Of these, the Egyptians had about 2,000 chariots, which remember is 4,000 men and 4,000 horses. The Hittites might have had more than that, and each of their chariots had 2 horses and 3 men. Both sides suffered heavy losses, though it's unclear exactly what that entails. The Hittites are said to have lost 2,000 chariots. We don't have even depictions of the battle from both sides. The Egyptian account has survived much more intact, but we do have a document for which both the Hittite and Egyptian versions survived. Though the two empires continued to fight in other arenas more akin to a Cold War, eventually the conflict would end. 16 years after the Battle of Kadesh, Ramesses would sign, along with Muwatalli's son Mursili, the world's earliest documented peace treaty. The Treaty of Kadesh marked the renunciation of hostilities and the declaration of brotherhood between Ramesses and Mursili. Boundaries were established, and more than that, an alliance was formed. If either party was attacked by a third, or even threatened by internal insurgency, the other would come to their aid. It featured extradition clauses, recognition of each other's sovereignty, and it called upon the gods of both lands to lay down curses if either side violated it. No longer concerned about his eastern frontier, Ramesses returned to Egypt and oversaw a period of tremendous architectural achievement. He even married a Hittite princess as part of the treaty, but he didn't return the favour. By and large, the kings of Egypt did not trade their daughters to foreign lands, though they didn't apply the same rule to daughters of noble families. Ambitious as the treaty was, as significant a moment in history as its signing may have been, it didn't help the Hittites. Nearly a century later, the Assyrians would march for their homeland. Ramesses II might have written a promise in stone, but Ramesses III, 90 years later, was either unable or unwilling to keep it. The Hittite kingdom was devoured. Maybe the gods upheld the treaty after all. Ramesses III was assassinated, and his kingdom fell within a century to drought, famine, and civil unrest. Chariots, as it turns out, will only get you so far. Before we move on to the last part of the essay, I'd like to thank my patrons at patreon.com/armchairegypt for their support. Rather than doing call-outs where I read out a list of names as coldly and quickly as possible, I'll instead vocally thank a small number of patrons each video. This time I'd like to particularly thank my patron Michael Bowman, who has supported the development of this channel in a number of ways even before launch. Michael, thank you, and may you be blessed with long life, prosperity, and health.
It's all over, but the cry.
Egypt would end in military unification just as it had begun, though this time it was being unified under a foreign empire. With a diplomatic blunder as pretext, the Persians under Cambyses II mustered a huge army and the aid of other nations and headed for Egypt. The first Battle of Pelusium was in 525 BCE. It saw 50,000 Egyptian deaths and only 7,000 Persian. The Egyptians had very little in the way of foreign support, Pharaoh Psamtek's allies having deserted him well in advance of the Persians' arrival. At Pelusium, Polyaenus writes that the Persians used psychological warfare to demoralize the Egyptians, driving cats, dogs, ibises, and all manner of sacred animals before them to cause the Egyptians to hesitate to attack. Herodotus doesn't mention this. I don't think that's necessarily damning to the Polyaenus version of events. Herodotus detested the Persians, and wouldn't have wanted their victory to be owed to something like good strategy or cunning. On the other hand, Polyaenus was writing a very long time after these events took place, in a time when Egyptian religious practice was so broadly unknown that he might be exaggerating the Egyptians' reverence for cats and dogs. Even so, it's an interesting idea, and on the face of evidence it seems as likely true as not. 180 years later, the Second Battle of Pelusium saw 120,000 Egyptian troops against 344,000 Persians. Despite some advantages owing to the terrain and fortification, the Egyptians lost, partly due to incompetent leadership and poor preparation, and the superior Persian numbers ensured their victory. With a few exceptions, Egyptian rebellions against Persian rule were put down with relative ease. Egyptian military might always depended on a strong central government. Persian rule was disrupted through a certain amount of guerrilla warfare, but in truth Egypt's last burst of independence was only possible because of infighting back in Persia. When Egypt was retaken, the Persians showed no mercy, destroying Egyptian cities, desecrating temples, and stealing and burning sacred texts. I think that, to simplify things a little, we can see that Egypt lost a lot of its early military advantages. It lost its ability to maintain a coherent central government, and wasn't really equipped philosophically to run the sorts of huge multinational empires that Persia and the like controlled. It's easy to say something like Egypt's time had come because we have retrospect and we can see that indeed its time had come, but there's a sense in which it had become a set of old ideas, not a tangible thing in its own right. The nations surrounding this Egypt didn't see it as a peer the way the Hittites had done. It was a source of goods and tax revenue, an exotic land with decaying gods, and a form of government that was prone to periodically collapsing. It takes more than military technology, advanced tactics, and self-motivation to survive in a world that considers you an inconvenience. And, whatever that thing is, the respect of the others, a cohesive and united society, perhaps even the support of the gods, Egypt seemed to have lost it by the time the Persians came to Pelusium. Of course, not every nation trampled by a superior foreign force deserves it, the opposite is almost always true, so it might be that whatever that ineffable X-factor was that kept Egypt afloat until it sank, maybe the Persians at that moment simply had it more. Well, this video didn't really ask a question, but I've tried to talk about the military history of Egypt in a way that shows it isn't about where your spearheads fit on the Mohs hardness scale, or how many troops you can muster. Nations go to war for a lot of reasons, but at the heart is often the desire to preserve itself, either by creating a buffer of other nations around it to fight on its behalf, or to be given the time to fortify and look inward. I'm of a mind that far fewer wars have ever been justified than have been waged, and I don't mean to paint war as some noble pursuit. It's an awful thing, even when the cause is just, and I don't want the takeaway of this video to be, battles are awesome, chariots for the win. The Egyptians showed a great deal of ingenuity, though perhaps if they'd shown a little more earlier on, they might have had enough time to stay ahead for a while longer. For my money, there's not much Egypt could have done against Persia come what may. Egypt's religion and culture made it hard for it to expand far beyond the Nile, and being so centralised has its disadvantages. The Persians, of course, didn't hold on to their empire for too long either, surrendering to Alexander the Great about a decade after its second conquest of Egypt. As with all things in history, what seems inevitable with hindsight isn't so clear at the time. We know that chariots will one day be made redundant by mounted units. We know that making a bow of composite materials leads to a better weapon than one made out of a straight stick. We know that eventually steel will be much better than bronze for making swords. War is always changing. It's the one thing about it that never changes. Thanks for sticking around. This one was a bit outside my wheelhouse, but I do have a certain fascination with how simple things like the properties of materials can lead to complex things like who will be king tomorrow. If you enjoyed this, please click like, please comment with any questions or other comments, and subscribe to my channel. I do a new video every week. Thanks so much to everyone who's been sharing my videos with friends or on social media. Every view and like and comment makes a huge difference to the survival of the channel and to me personally. I'm new to this YouTube business and there are lots of things I'm improving on, but it takes a lot of time and work to do it all. I'm enjoying it, but as a freelance writer, after a point I'll have to seriously look at how sensible it is to keep doing these videos. That's why I've got a Patreon. If you want to see more of these videos and at a higher quality, one day I'd love to hire an editor, get animation, have captions in multiple languages, etc. Please consider heading over to patreon.com/armchairegypt to help me out. There are lots of perks to membership of the Armchair Egyptology community, including the cosy satisfaction of knowing you're helping a smaller channel grow and improve. Eternal thanks to all of my existing patrons whose beautiful names you see before you. My character design is by Praxis Descends and Lazy Honeybee. Please follow them on Twitter for more of their work. Lazy Honeybee also designed my title card and colour scheme. My intro theme and the background music you hear playing right now is by Sassy Dragon. Check out more of her music on her SoundCloud, and you can catch her streaming a few times a week on her Twitch channel. The essay was written by me. Hi, I'm Lucas. If you think I do good words and you need good words done, hit me up with an inquiry to my business email, which is in the description below. I write and research articles and essays, I ghostwrite, and I write fiction on commission as well. If you're still here listening to the end credits, then may you live, prosper, and flourish. Subscribe for more videos if you haven't already, head over to my channel for more, or click here to watch whatever the YouTube demons are recommending today. You can also join my Discord to chat with me directly and meet other Egyptology nerds. There's a link in the description. See you next time!